Welcome back, and this week we're going to talk about some articles about ethnography. But before we get to ethnography, we're going to actually begin with a chapter on case study research that's in your textbook. And what I mainly want to draw your attention to as you're thinking about the textbook actually is so you can kind of skim this chapter and understand a little bit about what case studies are used for. And I think the argument that the author makes here is that case studies are really used a lot in the business world because they have a lot of face validity. It's something that people can look at and they can understand, and it makes a lot of sense to them. And if it worked for somebody else, it might work for them. And there's a whole industry built around selling case studies and all sorts of materials that support those case studies to businesses and decision makers. But one thing that you can look at is on page 84, and it says how to evaluate case study research. And there's a couple of frameworks here that are offered for how we can look at case studies and see if they actually apply in a meaningful and useful way. And the reason I think it's good to start with this chapter before you really dive into looking at the rest of the ethnographic articles that we're going to talk about is because a lot of times what ethnography produces is not that different from case study. It produces a lot of kinds of data that are very interesting and which are seemingly very useful, but which maybe have some issues in terms of projectability and validity. And so we need to become skilled at looking at data that are conducted in a secondary fashion and understanding how to apply those so that when we're collecting these really deep, rich primary data through a process like ethnography, we have a kind of a framework for evaluating if what we collected is useful and valid. And that's one reason why I think this chapter is really helpful. So let's move on to chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we actually, in the textbook, talk about ethnography in general. And this is a decent chapter in terms of kind of talking about the history and talking about different styles of ethnography. It's not a real long chapter because it really, you kind of feel like the author maybe feels a little out of his depth talking about this beyond a really academic way. And even in terms of the how to evaluate ethnographic research studies on page 99, I feel like the author doesn't really give a lot of detail beyond what Klein and Myers have to say in the article it's cited, but there's some useful stuff here. The examples are all very interesting, and I think in all of the chapters we've had to read, these are probably some of the better examples that have been provided, especially the speed trap, making ever faster decisions to survive. I think that one's really interesting. Star Trek's culture of consumption as well, you might recognize from earlier in our class, as that was one of the assigned articles in earlier weeks. So chapter 8, while kind of shallow and doesn't go nearly into the depth that some of our other articles do, it's a good framework for kind of starting out and understanding what ethnography is and how it's used and kind of what the different styles of it are. So now let's talk about this article from Ginzuk. And as I was reading through this article when I was preparing for this course years ago, I really like this article because it's comprehensive and readable in a way that I feel like if you can understand everything that's being talked about here, you're going to have a pretty good understanding of the breadth of the method. And he goes into a lot of detail and talks about a lot of different things that pertain to kind of the practical realities of what ethnography can be without going too much into detail into trying to classify everything. And there's even good summary details about how to be a good ethnographer and how to utilize interviews within ethnography and how to create site documents and even ethics. So this is a good kind of well-rounded approach towards talking about what ethnographic research is. And I think of all the articles, it's probably the most useful out of this packet in terms of just getting a broad understanding of what this method is about. Then we get to this other article that is called Using Ethnography in Strategic Consumer Research. And this is another decent article that I think does a good job of providing a survey of what ethnographic research can do. And it also talks about quasi-ethnographic research, which is something that goes into a little bit more depth than our other two readings have at this point. And again, it makes a good case for why this method is useful. It provides kind of a well-rounded approach towards looking at it. It's a little bit more academic in its approach, and they pretty extensively quote a lot of different authors throughout this. But again, they go through a lot of depth and detail. They offer a lot of different types of contexts in which ethnography might be conducted. They provide a few different techniques that you might use. And again, where I think this one is really useful is when they talk about quasi-ethnography and audience ethnography, where they kind of talk about some different ways of applying this method towards less rigorous approaches that maybe can generate something that's a little bit shorter, still useful, but not necessarily the depth and detail that a normal ethnographic study might take. Okay, so then we get into a few other chapters from different books or articles from different sources that are talking about different types of ethnography. And this one is really talking about team-based ethnography, where you're going to have a team of people that are working together to conduct an ethnographic study. And what I think is useful about this article is really the way that it helps you to ground the research in working as a team together rather than relying on a single individual researcher doing a lot of the work. And often a large ethnographic study is going to require a team. They're going to have to be people that are all on the same page. So this is very helpful in terms of offering a lot of good practical advice on how to do that. Multi-sited ethnography is another area where there is, again, some good practical knowledge that's being shared here. Again, I think you can skim this one and kind of get the gist of what it's about and then kind of go back to it, but it makes a case for why using multiple sites in your ethnography as opposed to just going to a single place or a single group of people and talking to them might provide you with better and more useful marketing insights. And it talks a lot about the process of field work, and again, cites a lot of academic sources, but provides some kind of good framework in terms of how things have been changing and how marketing researchers have found that using a more varied multi-sided approach can be really useful for getting to the insights that they're looking for. Then we have pushing the boundaries of ethnography and the practice of market research, which this is a really challenging article from a point of view of, this is someone, the author Rita M. Denny, who sees that there's this great method that can get really deep and useful and important insights, and doggone it, why aren't more people using it? And the argument here, I think, is that it's born a little bit out of frustration, saying, you know, this is something that can really get good, useful, deep data, but it's also something that's fraught with lots of problems, and there are many different things that cause this to be held back by bad practice and bad practitioners. The author also has a tendency to use some highfalutin words like transparency is the leitmotif, analysis is attenuated, which you know, if you know anything about music and sound, those are very evocative words. But if you don't, you know, we on the very next sentence get a Monty Python reference, so you just get a sense of this is something that's written by someone who's very intelligent and probably a little good on the geeky side, but maybe not good at communicating the readable detail of some of the other articles. So you might struggle with this one a little bit. And again, there's a lot of academic sources that are referenced that you might not be familiar with. But I do think that where this article gets it right is in kind of talking about what are the boundaries of good qualitative research. Where does ethnography push on those boundaries and allow us to go well beyond just what we can get out of focus groups or interviews or basic observational data? And if you can take some time to understand what's being argued here, you're going to come out all the better for it, really understanding the deep and insightful reasons that ethnography is a great method. Moving on, we have researching brands ethnographically, an interpretive community approach. So, you know, one of the things that we have to think about in the internet era is how brands take on a life of their own when they are turned over to internet communities. And you know, you just look at the news and constantly see brands being becoming memes, or you know, being used for community purposes that are completely different from the intended purpose of the brand. Different ways that people think about them and talk about them. they take on lives of their own once they're turned over to communities. And I think one of the things that we can talk about here that it really applies to the world that we're in is this idea of interpretive communities. So there is a dialogue that's going on between marketers and consumers, and marketers have to be careful not to allow that dialogue to get out of control, but they also have to be careful not to fail to acknowledge that dialogue. And so we have to look at brands and understand that they're bigger than what the marketers want the consumers to believe, and they're also bigger than what the consumers see the brands as in their usage of them. And so as that dialogue evolves, and research plays a large role in shaping that dialogue, there are opportunities to look at these interpretive communities and see how they are talking about and using brands, and then use that to extend what a brand can be. Okay, so far that's all pretty theoretical stuff, but what's cool about this article is that it references a lot of the other articles that we have read. So you're going to see some very familiar names and citations to things. Here we go, like Schouten and McAlexander, or Kozinets, Cultures of Consumption. So some of the things that we have been reading in this class are referenced here, and you're going to, because you've read these articles and we've talked about them, you're going to get a lot more out of this one than you might with some of the others, because the citations are going to be about things that you are a little more familiar with. And so talking about cultures of consumption, talking about how brands are impacted by the ways that consumers wrap them up into their lifestyles, really generates an interesting conversation here about how research can go well beyond just the surface level stuff that we often tend to ask, and really begin to understand people at a much deeper level. So this is good stuff, and I definitely recommend this one. Now we're going to talk about our case study of the week, and this is an ethnographic study that it's pretty short, but it's really interesting. And this one comes from some academic authors in Turkey who are trying to understand the culture of covered women they're Muslim women who wear head coverings. And in Turkey, there's a real divide between women who are Muslim and covered, and women who are Muslim and not covered. And of course, the ones that are not covered tend to be a little bit more liberal and socially progressive. The ones that are covered tend to be a little bit more conservative and dogmatic. And so what is interesting about this article is how these researchers want to infiltrate this culture, want to get a better sense of understanding of it, and want to learn more about it, and the ethnographic techniques that they use to try to penetrate that culture. And ultimately, they're not that successful. And they try a lot of different things. And one of the things that I think you need to pay key attention to is how they have to work with research assistants who are part of this culture in order to try to understand it better and to also find inroads into it. So maybe one of the reasons that they are unsuccessful is because they come in with a lot of presuppositions that they didn't take the time to validate before they really went out and did the research. But another thing that I think really holds them back is that they are trying to penetrate a culture that doesn't really want to be penetrated, and they're trying to talk to people who don't really want to have to talk about why they're doing what they're doing to people that aren't doing those things. So there's a lot of really interesting dynamics at play here. I think this is one of those articles that when students read it, a lot of times they have a lot of feelings about what they read when they really sit and think about it. So see what you think. It'll be interesting. So beyond all of that, we have several different articles that are from Quirks, and they're all about different applications of ethnography. And I'm not going to go through them all, honestly, because I think they're all pretty readable and pretty understandable. But what I do want to draw your attention to is this one here. This comes from the column, Qualitatively Speaking, Mobile, Yes, Ethnography, Not So Much. Now remember, during the last decade, there's been a huge attempt on the side of qualitative researchers to try to find ways to use electronic methods more often. And this is an article that's really talking about whether or not mobile ethnography is something that we ought to be embracing or something that we ought to be wary of, because the idea that everybody has one of these that they're carrying around and that they can become basically surrogate ethnographers who are recording them and sending them into researchers is really appealing, because it makes ethnography a lot easier to do, a lot cheaper, a lot more accessible. But does it lead to good insights? And that is what this article is about. Can you replace a trained observer who is going into the culture and being a part of it with something that allows you access to that culture, maybe even from a personal point of view that's kind of like seeing into that culture through someone else's eyes, but which doesn't give you all of the depth and context? So read about this, think about this, and try to understand that there are good sides and bad sides to utilizing technology. And after you've read all of the other articles that were in that folder that I just shared right here, these are all different ideas, and some of them are really exciting and interesting. But are they necessarily as good as the traditional method? That's for you to decide.